Hello, I'm Bob Goulder, a contributing editor with Tax Notes. This is the latest conversation in our series, Paying for the Pandemic. Today's guest is one of my favorite authors, Kimberly Clausing. She's a professor of economics at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, where she teaches tax, international trade, public finance, but she's probably best known as one of the country's leading experts on the taxation of multinational corporations. Kimberly Clausing, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So you wrote a piece recently for the Center for American Progress. It was very thought-provoking in a number of ways. You set out three guiding principles for how we should orient the economic recovery, and these are tax principles as opposed to general economic principles, but that's what our readers are here to learn about. The interesting thing, though, I have to say, is before we get into the details, at the very beginning of the article, you mentioned that if we go back in time to the beginning of this calendar year, the virus was already out there, we knew it was around, but the pandemic hadn't really hit us. You write in your piece that as far as our system of business taxation is concerned, we were not in a very good place to cope with these challenges. And that made me think, because when you think about where the country was in terms of the broader economy, and there's some objective measures of economic progress and so forth, whether it's employment or GDP growth or so forth, there's some markers out there suggesting that the economy wasn't doing too bad. But you say that the system of business taxation just wasn't equipped for the challenge we're with today. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think there are two really important ways in which the business taxation system at the beginning of this crisis was inadequate. One, it just doesn't raise that much revenue. And if you look at how much corporate tax revenue we're raising relative to GDP in the United States, it's about 1% after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was in effect. If you look at our history a few years ago, it was closer to 2%. If you look at peer nations, their corporate tax revenues relative to GDP are closer to 3%. So we're really at a third what other peer nations were doing with our corporate tax revenues. And before you think, well, probably that's because we have a large pass-through sector, you should also note that our corporate profits relative to GDP are actually quite a bit higher than those of most peer nations, because we have a very successful corporate sector. So in that sense, I would say it was inadequate as a tool for raising revenue. Now, why that's important is, there are other tools, of course, for raising revenue, but the corporate tax is also a very progressive tax. It falls disproportionately on those at the top of the distribution, especially when you compare it to alternative taxes. So when we're thinking about raising the money that we need for the state and doing it in a fair way, that is a very useful tool for taxing capital income. And it's also worth noting that we don't tax a lot of that income at the individual level. About 70% of U.S. equity income goes untaxed by the U.S. government at the individual level because it's in 529s or endowments or pensions or IRAs or things like that. A second way in which I would say it was inadequate is it wasn't really suited to the global economy. Even though some of the reforms of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were helpful, they really didn't fully address either profit shifting problems with the tax avoidance leaking out to havens or the offshoring incentives. And in fact, that legislation actually created some new offshoring incentives. So when we look at some of the international concerns that people have about tax competition and tax avoidance, that legislation didn't really solve it. So in those senses, I would say we weren't really ready for this crisis in business tax. If we look at more broadly how the economy is doing, you could say, yeah, GDP was doing great. But I would also point out that one way in which we weren't prepared for the crisis more broadly is that income inequality in this country continues to be a really vexing problem. And we've seen that in the early days of this crisis, that those in the bottom have been much more harmed by the crisis than those at the top. For some of us, it's not that uncomfortable. You have to work from home and you have to do Zoom meetings, but it's not as uncomfortable. But for the vulnerable people in our population, I think this has been a much harder time.
Based on your past writings, you're not really the biggest fan of TCJA, are you? In fact, one of the articles you wrote, you actually listed, was it the 5 fatal flaws of TCJA? And I got the sense in reading that article that you could have gone on and made it like the 10 fatal flaws or the 20 fatal flaws. But here's the question. We've got it now. It's up and running. So what do you do with it? I mean, a lot of people are looking ahead to the future in 2021, and who knows what the political landscape in Washington, D.C. is going to be like. But hypothetical question, if we handed you the reins of power today, would you just repeal TCJA and go back to where we were pre-December 2017? Or since it's a system that's up and running now, would you keep it in place and just tinker with it around the edges?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a typical economist answer, which is both. It depends on which part of it you're talking about, I guess. So if we take some provisions are worthy of outright repeal, and I think the 199A pass-through deduction is a great example of something that should just be repealed because it's inefficient, it's not equitable, it's complicated. You know, it really managed to do the rare trifecta of making the tax system worse in all three of those areas, which is something that many of its critics have noted. So that's a case of outright repeal. On both the individual and the corporate side, I can see using elements of what they've done and building on them and making them better. So on the individual side, for instance, expanding the child tax credit was a nice move, but it should be made fully refundable, in my opinion. I think raising the size of the standard deduction actually is kind of a useful step to reducing some of the tax preferences that might be harmful. So for instance, if we look at the mortgage interest deduction, I think most economists aren't a huge fan of that. That interest deduction is actually much easier to get rid of now because all the middle income people are no longer itemizing. So when we're thinking about who that interest deduction is helping, it's typically helping people who are already well off by larger houses with lower mortgage payments. So once you take into the tax angle into account. So I think that there are some useful building blocks on the individual side that one could build on. But there are also parts of it that I think were misguided on the individual side. So I don't think we can afford the big rate cuts. You know, the pass-through deduction is technically on the individual side as well. You know, the estate tax, raising the exemption to twice its prior level, I think that was unjustified and made no sense whatsoever. On the corporate side, which is, you know, as you know, my specialty, I also think that there's some useful ways that this legislation provides building blocks. So for instance, by no longer taxing income upon repatriation, it sort of ended that deferral problem. That said, I think it ended it in a way that really makes explicit the preference for foreign income, because if you earn income abroad, you can, often it's tax-free, which is much better than 21%. But even if you fall prey to some of these minimum taxes, the rate is half the US rate, approximately. And so that still really tilts the playing field in favor of foreign income relative to domestic income. Now it's fixable. So what I would do in that case is I would raise the rate on the minimum tax to be closer to the US rate, right? At which point you've really gotten rid of the deferral problem, and you've also reduced this sort of tilt towards the foreign income. And I also suggest making it a per country tax, but that probably is getting a little arcane for this stage of the interview. But there are useful things we can build on. I do think raising rates is going to be necessary across the board. So one tricky thing about being handed the reins of power is it's going to be hard to tell the business community, hey, we've got some really good things for you. In addition, you're going to pay more taxes. You know, it's true that there are things that you can tell the business community, like we're going to be better at handling the coronavirus. We're going to not start willy-nilly trade wars. You know, so you could imagine that there are things that you can give the business community, but it's going to be hard to give them tax cuts, any of them tax cuts anymore, because that horse is out of the barn. And, you know, a lot of revenue has been given away. So pursuing a revenue neutral reform for business is no longer an option, I would say.
Excellent. Well, let's get to the meat of your article then. 3 principles for business taxation to guide the recovery. The first principle, you talk about the need for short-term liquidity concerns. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so if we look at this pandemic, it's really such an interesting and, you know, depressing time. There hasn't been anything like it in my lifetime, where you've had such a large and severe public health crisis that you've basically shut down big sections of the economy, and other parts of the economy people are very reluctant to partake of. So if you think about flying, for instance. So that's really damaged a lot of businesses in a very noticeable way. And absent sort of liquidity assistance, helping them with loans and in some cases grants to tie them over until this is over, you could imagine quite a number of small businesses in particular, but also large businesses facing bankruptcy due to the dramatic reduction in revenue. So if you think, for instance, about a restaurant, or if you think about an airline, right? In both of those cases, it would be difficult to argue that they can just persevere through a crisis that's starting to look like it might take a full year to resolve. So in that instance, I think it makes perfect sense for the government to step in with liquidity assistance. In some cases, that can be an outright grant, because it might be the case that the small restaurant, right, isn't going to have enough money to pay back the loan, and so you can sort of do grant and loan combinations. But we also have to be careful, and I think here we need to distinguish between what's temporary and what's permanent, right? So if a business were having losses in earlier years, or if a business had a business model that no longer worked in today's economy, we wouldn't want to be necessarily propping up such businesses. So one distinction I make is between airlines and cruises, and I'm not sure whether this is just my personal preference, but when I sort of imagine a future a year from now, I hope very much that I'll be able to take similar numbers of plane trips that I used to take, because that's how I go and interact with people like Bob in person. But I have to say that looking at health outcomes of people penned up together like in a cruise, right? Cruises have long had health issues that are broader than just this one. You can get various other more minor viruses that circulate on cruises all the time. So if I were somebody sort of contemplating my vacation, the cruise might look less good than it used to, especially with this really vivid depiction of what can go wrong on a cruise ship, right? So in that case, we might say, well, some of these cruise companies probably do need to go bankrupt if there are a lot of people like Kim out there who are suspicious of cruises, right? But the airlines probably don't need to go bankrupt because we think people will resume traveling, right? And so some of these judgments can be difficult to make, but I think that the goal is to help companies that you think under the normal course of business would be sustainable, but not to prop up ones whose fundamental business model has been shown to be problematic.
I think as we're speaking, the cruise ship industry is now busy hiring some lobbyists, bearing in mind your answer to that question. Yeah. Now, not to dwell on cruise ships, but a lot of them are based in tax havens, aren't they? Does that, and this isn't just about airplanes versus cruise ships. Let's back up and look at the economy as a whole. Is there any point in the federal government trying to bail out and save a business organization that isn't incorporated in the United States?
Yeah, I would distinguish here, between some companies that might have subsidiaries in the United States but be headquartered in other countries. So you can imagine, for instance, if Toyota has plants in Ohio, but it's headquartered in Japan, we still might think that the Ohio plants deserve some support or government assistance. But when we have companies like the cruise ships that are conveniently headquartered in tax havens where they're receiving all the full benefits of the countries in which they operate, but they're not paying tax to any government, right? Except for maybe minimal fees to the tax haven governments. It's hard for me to argue that hardworking taxpayers should be subsidizing the survival of such companies. So in my view, it's sort of a pay-to-play system. If you want to be a responsible corporate citizen and pay your taxes and do the sort of normal things that we expect people to do, then you can expect to society as a whole to support you in your time of need. But if you've gone out of your way to invert the company and put it into a tax haven so that you wouldn't ever have to owe the US government anything, then I'm not sure the US taxpayer should be really worried about your future.
That feels a little bit like the old "Do you have skin in the game?"
Yeah.
Argument. It's not like apples to apples, but there's a tinge of that thinking in there. I think so. So that's interesting. I think most people would agree with you. Now, let's move on to your second guiding principle, and this is about the relief being targeted and temporary. And the first thing that comes to my mind is you could come up with the perfect short-term stimulus that works like a charm, and when the virus is all over and we return back to normal, thank goodness, whenever that happens, sooner rather than later. But the companies are going to want to keep the stuff going. So what are your thoughts here on targeting the relief and keeping it temporary?
Yeah, so I think the temporary part is extremely important because you're exactly right. As soon as you give someone a tax preference, they're going to fight pretty hard to keep it for as long as possible. So I think policymakers need to be really cognizant of a few facts. One is that the US collects a lot less tax revenue as a share of GDP than other rich countries, but yet we try to do a lot. And there's more things that we need to do, right? So you can't give a tax preference to one group of people without either limiting the ability of the state to do the things it needs to do, or getting the revenue from some other group of people. Like, everything comes with an opportunity cost. So I think keeping these temporary and focusing on the crisis while the crisis is here is a wise thing to do. Targeting is also really important. And if you look at the legislation, for instance, the CARES Act, there were some elements of that I think were well targeted and some that were poorly targeted. So take, for instance, the treatment of losses or the interest limitations. It would make perfect sense to say to a company like, okay, in 2020, you had a lot of extra losses due to this virus. We understand. We're going to give those losses a more generous treatment. Like, maybe you can carry them back for a year or two, or maybe you're not limited with that 80% limit on how much you can offset next year's income. Those both seem somewhat reasonable to me. Whereas if you do what Congress did, though, you also say to companies, okay, well, if you had losses in 2018 or 2019, we're also going to treat those favorably. And if you took out too much debt in 2019, you can also have the interest limitation released on that. Well, the last time I checked, we didn't have the coronavirus in the US economy in 2019 or 2018. So why are we doing that? Well, you might say, okay, well, companies are going to take a while to access what happens with the 2020 taxes. And this way they can get money right away. But then you're channeling money to companies in particular that were unsuccessful in those years, not to those that were doing well. And that seems like a stupid thing to do. So I think there were ways in which this was not well targeted, and Congress should be a little careful of that. And there were also things that I think were pretty generous at the time that we might want to sort of rethink or claw back to, right? So for instance, there were a lot of companies that got really generous loan forgiveness, even though their operations might have looked, pretty indistinguishable from what they were before. So I have an example of a friend who has a law firm, and it's really had the same amount of business it had all along, but it qualified for these loans that then let it actually be forgiven if it kept its payroll up, right? And so what you're really doing is you're now subsidizing a successful firm that hasn't seen a reduction in its business. So I think another thing Congress could think about is, does it want to take companies that received these really generous benefits and either treat that as taxable income or deny the deductions for the way it was spent? And at present, they're kind of letting companies have both. And that seems maybe a little more generous than even today's desperate situation calls for. So I think paying some attention to and I understand that, of course, in a time of crisis, you want to just kind of shovel money out the door and hope that you're preventing the next Great Depression. But once people have time to sort of think and study about this, I think paying close attention to targeting and to keeping things temporary actually makes it easier for the government to be more effective in doing the most important things that it needs to do in responding, rather than just throwing money around.
You mentioned before the concept of opportunity cost, which is a great concept to anybody who's sat there in Econ 101 in college and tried to wrap their head around these concepts. But can you explain the concept of opportunity cost as it relates to the government handing out tax breaks? Because you might think if there's an infinite supply of money they can dole out, then is there really an opportunity cost?
Yeah. It's really interesting to see that both the left and the right have these sort of wishful thinking versions of this. On the right, it's this sort of traditional supply side economics, which is this idea that, well, if we give a large tax cut, it'll pay for itself because it will unleash this sort of nirvana of new activity, and the new tax base will be so big that it'll pay for whatever revenue you lost. And that's been disproven time and again. On the left, there's also hope that, well, deficits don't really matter. Maybe we can just monetize a lot of this, or maybe we don't have some of the constraints that we thought we did, and so we should just kind of spend with reckless abandon. So I do think in both cases, there's serious problems with that line of thinking, right? I mean, it may be the case that 90% debt to GDP ratio is not a magic number for the United States, that we can go higher than that. And there are reasons to think we can, because we have the advantage of issuing our debt in dollars, and because in history we've tended to pay it back, and so we can borrow at low interest rates. But even that said, let's say you're going to spend another 30% of GDP on something and it's deficit financed, there are some choices that are much better than others, right? So if you're investing in infrastructure, or you're investing in education, you're investing in people, right? Those are all things that you can get paid back for, because the child will grow up as a smarter person and a taxpayer that pays back, or the infrastructure will crumble in a way that's less expensive to repair. And so those types of public investments, there's a really sound argument for deficit finance. But is there a sound argument for deficit finance to give capital gains tax cuts to investors who've already done really well? I think that argument is a much trickier one to make. And whatever you're spending the money on, you're kind of precluding the opportunity to spend it on something else, because eventually you do hit the budget constraint, right? And all debts do tend to get paid back. And if you don't pay back your debts, then the next debts are even more expensive interest-wise. Just ask Argentina. So I think these opportunity costs are really important to keep in mind.
It sounds like you're someone who does not believe that the United States is immune to the bond market.
That's correct. I mean, I think the bond market is we're not immune from it. I don't think interest rates are going to be really high, in the next years. I mean, I do think there's really solid arguments to be made that have been made by people like Larry Summers about secular stagnation, or Ben Bernanke talking about the savings glut. I mean, there's reason to expect long-term interest rates to be quite low for some time. But even so, even if you're borrowing, 30% of GDP to do something, you should borrow it to do the things that have the highest social gain, right? So I agree that interest rates are likely to be low, but I don't agree that that means we can just do whatever we want with the purse strings. There's some much better things to do than other things. And I also think setting up a tax system, so that it functions well and it does what it's supposed to be doing, will probably entail, in the United States, taking in more money, because there's a lot of things that we're going to need to pay for. We've promised our retirees things like Social Security and Medicare. We have serious needs in sort of supporting workers for the modern economy, which includes more education and training, and expanding things like the earned income tax credit, and all those things, take some money. So I would suggest we keep that in mind.
That leads directly to your third principle, which is pretty straightforward stuff. When the crisis is behind us, are we going to have to increase taxes on corporations? There's a certain amount of money, and we can gauge it, and there's statistics on this. How much revenue are we really squeezing out of the corporate sector? And the corporate sector is not all homogeneous. There's small corporations, big multinationals, so forth, domestic income, foreign income. But but you've said time and time again that the amount of revenue that we're squeezing out of that sector just doesn't seem to cut it.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that if you are raising money, there are trade-offs there too, right? So the fact that we're only collecting 1% of GDP from the corporate tax instead of 3%, like our trading partners, means that 2% of GDP is being collected from some other tax or not being spent on things that people need. So why do I like the corporate tax? There's a couple of reasons. I think it's actually a pretty efficient tax. And we're pretty close to exempting the normal return to capital in the way that we've structured the tax now. A lot of it is falling on companies that are earning above normal profits. So what we think of as sort of market power type companies that get more than the normal return to capital, right? And taxing companies with market power is efficient. It actually doesn't distort as much as taxing the normal return to capital. So that's one really important consideration, is thinking about the efficiency of the tax. In addition, as I've mentioned before, there are really important equity arguments here. If you look over the past generation, we've seen a big increase in the capital share of income and a big decrease in the labor share of income. We've seen big increases in income inequality. We've seen a lot of people in the bottom half of the population who've had pretty stagnant wages. So telling those people that they need to pay more taxes for the goodies and services we need seems difficult. Whereas telling corporations that now have historically high corporate profits relative to GDP, and I don't mean now this month, I mean in the last decade or the last 2 decades, their profits relative to GDP have been much higher than they have been in prior decades of US history, right? So this seems like an area where we can tax more with relatively low efficiency costs and have those who've really done well through the global economy and through technical change and through other trends that we've seen, have them pay a little more of that share. Now, the one argument against that you would make, I think, is that, well, corporations are mobile and people aren't. And so if you tax that corporation, it might just move everything somewhere else, and then we'll just have less here in the United States. And I think that kind of argument and that kind of thinking was in part behind the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was this idea that we have to be competitive to keep our companies here. And I think that argument is misleading, because I'm not saying that you can raise the corporate tax to 50%, but if you look at the corporate tax space, there are lots of ways to actually combat this international shifting problem when companies move their income to tax havens. There are a lot of really off-the-shelf, pretty easy ways to counter some of that mobility. And the reason we haven't done those things isn't because they're not feasible. It's because we've lacked the political will to really care about raising money from these very powerful entities. And there's a lot of money there. So I think once the political will is there, there's some really good solutions. You just take the minimum tax we have now and you make it tougher. And then if a company moves their income to Bermuda, you still get a claim on taxing it in the United States because you've got this tough minimum tax. I also think there's room for countries to coordinate more with each other in protecting the corporate tax base. So, for instance, if we had an agreement with the European Union, say, and this could be actually the basis for a new modern trade agreement in the next administration, where you said, okay, we're going to work on market access between these big economies, but we're also going to work on making sure we're both having a minimum tax for our corporations, right? And if the EU and the US did that simultaneously, right, that would actually act as an incentive for the rest of the world to have sort of a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom, because they'd know that if they're companies, if companies based in their countries or shifting income to their countries, if they don't tax that revenue, the EU or the US is going to come along and try to tax it, right? So if we had this sort of coordinated move in that direction, I actually think we could make a globalization that's much fairer for typical people, and that asks everybody, including corporations, to pay for the funding of the state.
Well, your last response conjures up images of global tax harmonization, or at least between the U.S. and the EU, as you phrased it. So since we're talking about the corporate tax, I can't not ask you about what you think about the BEPS project or the latest iteration of the OECD's BEPS project. We have an inclusive framework. It's now up to almost 140 countries. They have these Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 reforms, and that's not what this discussion is about in detail, so we don't need to get into the intricacies of it. But there have been big questions asked about like whether the US is really on board with this and whether we've sort of broken up with the OECD and said, you go and do that, we're going to sort of sit this one out, guys. What's your take on that? Should the US be participatory in this dialogue?
Yeah, I think that the fact that the OECD G20 BEPS process has done as much as it has really speaks to the frustration of a lot of people in governments about not being able to combat this profit shifting problem. I do think that despite the efforts, which have been substantial, and despite the results, which have been noticeable, we still have a problem that's pretty similar in size to the one we had before this whole coordination started, right? And so I actually think that the OECD processes will need to be bolder and extend past what they've done, for instance, with Pillars 1 and Pillar 2. One difficulty with the US and supporting those pillars, I think, has been that because they're focused on digital taxation and because the most successful digital companies in the world are at present in the United States, it sort of feels to both to both Democrats and Republicans, like the US companies are being singled out for this extra treatment. So I think one way that might help sort of bring the US on board, in addition to getting rid of the Trump administration, which is hostile to all forms of international cooperation. But beyond that, I think you could sort of look at a way to make some of the principles behind those digital tax initiatives extend a little more broadly, right? So we think all income should be taxed somewhere. Right? That's a principle, right? A minimum tax principle doesn't have to just be digital companies. It can be pharma, it can be tech, it can be, German car companies and French pharma companies and whoever, on the globe is making, these high profit products, I think should be subject to some minimum level of taxation. And so taking some of those same principles and making them a little broader might feel to the US government less like our companies are being singled out to pay more tax. And that might be one way to push things forward. But I also think we just need a reset in how the US government is interacting with every international institution lately, because they've done a lot to undermine the WTO, the WHO, the UN, the OECD, NATO, the left, the TPP, left Paris. These are sort of historic turns away from the world economy. And if I'm hopeful that the next administration will be more open to all of those types of cooperation, because one thing we've seen with this pandemic is that our troubles don't really stop at the border. And so we need better tools for cooperating with other countries.
So you've said that you're a fan of doing more with the corporate tax. It doesn't bring in a whole lot of revenue, certainly not like it used to. From time to time, we hear about the need for an alternate revenue source. And if you go back about 20 years or so, Michael Gretz had the great book about a value-added tax as a supplemental tax to the tax systems we already have. And you wrote a book last year, Open, where you hardly mentioned the word VAT, but you had some praise for a carbon tax. So in the back of my mind, we're thinking there are these other tools out there. Certainly, a lot of countries are using VAT. VAT's being used all over the world. A carbon tax, not so much, at least presently, but it does have this great benefit that you put a price on your carbon footprint. So there's a positive externality that you certainly don't have when you're talking about VAT. I don't think there's a positive externality with VAT, but not foreclosing the possibility of an alternate revenue source. You're just saying, let's try to get the corporate tax right. Or how do you weigh those two?
Yeah, so I think there's no reason not to be ambitious and try to do both. And in fact, I actually think politically it would be easier to pass a package of tax measures that wasn't just business, but that also had other things for other groups to like just raising business taxes. You can get 2 trillion. It's not nothing, right? Over 10 years with pretty reasonable business tax reforms. But I think getting more revenue but while paying attention to things like climate change, would be a really nice add. And you could also couple that bill with big expansions of things like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit to help those at the bottom of the distribution. And so if you hand out some goodies to people and you respond to climate change and you do the business tax package in one grand bargain, it has some advantages relative to just doing them in isolation. You can give each constituency something. You don't have to raise taxes too high to get to the revenue that you need because you've got more than one tax source. The carbon tax, I think, is long overdue. It's a really a beautiful tax instrument, I would say. It's my favorite of all of the taxes because what it really does is it actually reduces inefficiency when you tax carbon because we are producing too much carbon. We're not internalizing that externality. So when we make carbon more expensive, we're discouraging something that's bad. Whereas when we make labor savings more difficult, we're discouraging things that we think we should reward. It's not a small amount of revenue. You can get, if you have a modest carbon tax that goes over 10 years from $0 to $50 a metric ton, that raises $1 trillion. If you were more interested in getting to the social cost of carbon, you'd start at 50 and go to 100. That would raise $3 trillion over 10 years. So that's some serious amount of money. I think one way to sort of build political support for that would be to take at least part of the revenue and turn it into a carbon dividend, where you would basically deposit into people's accounts or send them checks with the Statue of Liberty on them, their share of this carbon revenue. And the reason to do that, I think, is to build support for it, but also to sort of have like a green universal income, right? It's not going to be as large as Yang would like, but you could sort of say, okay, listen, we're paying this price at the pump and in our utility bills. But for those in the bottom 70% of the population, if we just sort of divided up the carbon tax revenue on an even per capita basis and sent it back, they would actually be better off with the tax and dividend, right? So they could feel that they were getting something for these green sacrifices and they'd have some little bit of money coming in from that source. And I think that would be a nice way to build support for it. And then if you ended up needing the money for other things, you could lower the dividend. But people would already have taken millions of actions in their lives and in their business decisions that really fully internalize this massive threat that we face from climate change. And I think if there's one thing we've learned from the coronavirus is that if you ignore threats, they often get very costly, right? And we were willing to shut down the entire economy for a length of time to deal with this threat. Well, the climate change is a really big threat too, and with much smaller sacrifice, just paying more at the pump and paying more at our utility bills and paying more for carbon intensive production, we can really change, the evolution of the planet's fitness to host human life, among other things, right? And I think that's something that we've neglected for too long. And this is a case where we can kind of achieve two really important policy goals with one instrument. So if I could do one tax proposal, that actually might be the one I would do. Even though I study corporate taxes, and I would really like to fix that, and I know the most about those. But a carbon tax is also just it's a really a great policy idea that I think we should take seriously, keeping opportunity cost in mind, right? Because it's if you have to raise some revenue, why not tax something that's bad?
Well, we're going to have to get the revenue from somewhere because the deficit is not getting any smaller, that's for sure, whether it's a corporate tax or a carbon tax or anything else. Kimberly Clausing, as usual, you have given us so much food for thought. We thank you for publishing, we thank you for writing, and we thank you for teaching and for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's great to be here.